Welcome, Kate. Welcome, Rosemary. Very excited about this. I'm I don't personally work in IP creatively, so I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say and learn a lot from both of you who have great experience in it. I'm a writer and editor. Nice cat, Kate.
Yeah,
Oh, baby.
You have to introduce your cat
I
when you
will. I will. Yeah, she loves a Zoom.
So I am a business consultant for early stage companies in my day job. So I work with a lot of IP that way and with a lot of legal issues there and making sure everybody is protected and able to defend it. That probably won't come into play as much here as I thought it might be, but we'll see what happens. So if each of you wants to introduce yourselves and talk about what kind of IP you work with, and if you have any upcoming releases or anything you want to promote, go ahead and start. Rosemary, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi, my name is Rosemary Jones, and I started working in IPs or intellectual properties when I answered a writer's call for Wizards of the Coast. They were looking for new Forgotten Realms authors almost 15 years ago. It feels like it was yesterday. And they had a book that nobody wanted to write, which was the Goddess of Pain. They were doing all the deities in the Forgotten Realms, and nobody wanted to do the Goddess of Pain. So I pitched them a Pygmalion story where the statue of the Goddess of Pain, he falls in love with it, and she comes alive and leads on quite a dance. And they told me they didn't want a funny novel about the Goddess of Pain, but they liked my writing, and so would I come back and pitch again? So that was I did not write that book. I would say I fell into it by losing a contest, but they kept asking me to submit. I managed to sell them a short story, and then after several tries, got a novel pitch in that Wizards liked, and so then I ended up writing two novels for them and one ebook serial thingy that's really kind of like a long novella, but it was broken into four parts because they were selling it piece by piece when they were trying to relaunch Neverwinter. So it was I always sort of call it a novel because it's close to 60,000 words, but you have to buy it in four parts if you want to read it on Amazon. Um, and that was really fun. And then Wizards of the Coast did their usual thing where they U-turned and went a different direction. And my editor went off to work for Amazon, and I stopped writing for a while. And then a friend said, "Hey, this company named Aconite is starting up, and they are spinning novels off of writing game properties. And they're looking for experienced writers, and you should apply." And I was weirdly, I'd just gotten laid off of a job, and I went, "Oh, well, that'll be an interesting thing." It's I'm doing the pitches, and they come back and they all the high fantasy stuff they didn't want me for, but they wanted me for Arkham Horror, which is basically 1920s setting, and it's a board game and a card game, which I was aware of. And the pitch that won was, silent movie crew goes and makes movie and haunted house in Arkham, and they went, "Oh, that's so cool." And then can our characters be extras? And I went, "Sure." So that's the very short how I got into writing for IPs, and still am. And my next book out in Arkham Horror will be Bootlegger's Dance. It is the first Christmas novel set in the series, and it will be out in November.
Awesome. Yeah, so I am Kate Hartfield, she, her, and I live near Ottawa, Canada. And yeah, I am a writer of all kinds of things. I have several of my own novels out. By my own, I mean in the sense that I own the rights to them. So we'll get into that in a minute. But the Embroidered Book came out last year, which is a historical fantasy novel. And I just had one called The Valkyrie, which is a retelling of myth, come out in the UK a couple of weeks ago, and it'll be out in North America this summer. But the reason I'm on this panel is because I also write tie-in novels, and Rosemary and I have some overlapping experience because I also write books for Aconite Press. I remembered to bring my book with me. So this is The Magus Conspiracy in the Assassin's Creed universe, which came out last year, and it's set in the 19th century and roams all over Europe. And the next one for that series is called The Resurrection Plot, and it is coming out this summer. And the cover has just been revealed recently, and so we're good to go with that. And I've done a little bit of other stuff in the sense that I've written for a video game, for example, and then I did an associated comic for that video game. So I have a little bit of other non-Assassin's Creed experience, but like 95% of my entire experience is with this Assassin's Creed series.
Okay, so that's great. Both of you work for Aconite. I think we'll touch on that in a little bit later. Rosemary already gave a little bit of how she got into it. Kate, how did you start getting involved with Aconite and with IP in general?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where everyone's story is it's hard to reproduce because everyone's path into it is a little bit different. But definitely, I think having some experience with other publications can help, and especially for someone like Aconite when they are typically looking for someone who has published before. But I don't want to speak for them. I mean, they I think have their own ways of deciding who they want to write for them, but and so the way I came into it is I had an agent and I had written other books, and most of my work is in historical settings. That tends to be how I work. And so when my agent let me know that there was an opportunity for tie-in novels with a game in a historical setting, and that's all I knew about it at first. And I thought, I wonder if it's Assassin's Creed because I play Assassin's Creed book games, and my partner and my kid play Assassin's Creed games, and between the three of us, we probably played almost all of them in this house. So I was already familiar with the games, and I love working in historical settings. So even not knowing anything but that, I sent off an email to my agent, and I said yes, I would be interested in at least finding out more about this. And so then, of course, the first thing you do is you sign the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement, which we can talk about. And then I was able to put together some pitches. So I put together some pitches of stories. They gave me an overall time frame and said, "What would you like to do?" And so I had some pitches, and I went back and forth a few times with my editor at Aconite. And then once we had kind of refined it into something that worked for both of us, we got the green light from Ubisoft, which is the games company that owns the rights to Assassin's Creed and which works with Aconite, because Aconite is a publisher that has partnerships with all these different properties. So yeah, so it's a bit of a process to get that to happen. I think it was about 6 or 7 months from the initial email from my agent to green light contract, off you go, see you in 4 months with a completed manuscript.
Nice. Rosemary, did you have any other origin story additions?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I think so the thing to know about IPs is that there are all very different levels. So I got into writing for Wizards because I live in the Pacific Northwest. I'm in Seattle, and Wizards is actually a Northwest company. So they were popping up at conventions I was at, and one of the things that was then, and I think even now, always their battle cry is we want more women writing for us because let's see, when I was writing for them, they had two. I was one of them. And they generally weren't and haven't been much better than that through most of their publishing period. The other thing is they didn't really care if you had an agent or not, and they were taking direct solicitations. And I have never bothered to go out and get an agent. Every book I've sold, and I've done about 7 or 8 nonfiction at this point, and this is my 5th paperback novel that's coming out this year. I have just sold direct to the publisher, so that is some advantage. On the other hand, if you want to get into something like Star Wars, Star Trek, Dungeons and Dragons now, with the Honor Among Thieves prequel novels, you have to have an agent. It's just the level of where they're at and the legalities and stuff. They want you to be working through an agent and have that. So it's it's kind of an interesting thing about that. There's also a lot of smaller IPs which we haven't touched on. So obviously Arkham Horror and Forgotten Realms are the two IPs that I write in and have written in that are, fairly well known. I have done short stories and bits and pieces for a bunch of Kickstarter projects, and I call them the Friends of Ed Greenwood projects because invariably Ed, who created the Forgotten Realms and lives in Canada and is one of the world's nicest people, gets approached to contribute a story to a fledgling high fantasy IP, and I think Ed just has like a list of our names and he just throws them out there and says, yeah, I'd be interested, but you could contact some of these other Forgotten Realms authors and they could contribute to your anthology too. Because I invariably get the email will invariably come into me with, hi, Ed gave me your contact information. Would you, and I'm doing um a book, we're doing a game and it's going to be, people have ESP with animals and can you write an ESP with animals story? And I usually go, yes, of course, that sounds like fun. So, and those are very often, quite small. They don't pay a ton, but they're usually kind of fun to do. And they don't necessarily last more than a couple of years. And then I get the rights back to the story because the person has decided to go on and do something else. And either they write me and tell me I can have my story back. And so I've packaged up some of those and resold them as a little anthology now. And almost all of them started out as IPs. And then there's a third one, which I know, Greg, you were interested in, which I worked with a guy, and he's now one of my best friends, and he's my game master when I'm playing RPGs, named Nate Crowder, who started a series of books about a superhero city called Cobalt City. And I want to say about 10 years ago, he said, gee, it'd be really fun if I did a Christmas story, but I don't think I have enough to fill a book. And I went, oh, I'd love to write a Christmas story set in your stories because I really love them. He said, oh, you could do one. And then so-and-so, we know he could do one. And so we ended up putting together a small anthology called Cobalt City Christmas. And that was the slippery slope down which we slid to. Now we have, uh, I call them the Cobalt City Collective. We all write stories. We write set in this one city. Nate is kind of the keeper of the lore and gives us blessings on stuff, but it's very artist collective style. We spin off different projects. There's been a podcast, there's been a comic book. I've done a novella, which now we're trying to figure out how I'm going to republish it. And yeah, there's just all this other stuff that comes out, and it's super fun. I won't want to say that it's going to pay any of my bills, but it is super fun and it's creative. And I write with these people every Sunday morning right now. So that's another type of IP where we're kind of an artist collective, all ripping off each other's shared world.
Nice. So just a quick follow-up question on that. Do you guys have like a contract amongst each other or something where like who owns the IP? Is it just all of you kind of have it loosey-goosey, we're all good with each other, or do you have something more
Cobalt City,
formal?
yes, definitely. It's very loosey-goosey because it is just, again, we are all friends or friends of friends, um, and like I said, there's no big money in this, so nobody's particularly concerned. And Dawn, who runs the publisher, who's bringing the stuff out, I mean, she sets a contract, but it is very much, we have kind of an agreement. On the other hand, if something like Wizards of the Coast or the Aconite books, yes, I definitely have a contract. Kate's got a contract. They're very clear about what we own, what we don't own, which is basically we don't own it, they own it. Anything we create, they own. Um, and there's, you know, they we have to respect their rights. The game company owns their characters, so on and so forth. So yeah, there's levels of things like that.
Yeah, Kate, anything you want to add to kind of the contracts or any of that process? Anything that's jumped out at you as being a little odd or different with IP versus other things that you've done, like with your agent and other publishers?
Yeah, I think the just the thing to be aware of for writers getting into it, I think, is just what it means exactly that you don't own the IP. So intellectual property, it's funny because, as Greg knows well, it means just anything that you own. And so we all have intellectual property. Every time we sit down and write something, we've created intellectual property. But we use it kind of colloquially often to mean intellectual property that the writer doesn't own. So when you're working with someone else's IP, what it means to not own that in a practical sense is that, if the book is translated, like my Assassin's Creed book has now been translated into a few languages, and I don't get any say over that. I don't get any money from that. It's just, it just happens, which is lovely. But whereas if you have your own book, depending on your contract, and how your agent and your editor work and your publisher, you can actually sell those rights severally to different places, and you can get more money every time. Things like film rights, if they decide, okay, well, we think that Kate's book would make a fantastic animated TV show, that's great for me, but I'm not going to see a cent from it probably. So there are different contracts for, like, an IP can be different, but generally speaking, that's the default assumption, is that if you don't own something, you can't then go and sell it to someone. So that's just something to be aware of. I don't think there are any other real pitfalls, but there are things like, as I mentioned earlier on, the non-disclosure aspects of it, which tend to be much more robust than if you were working on something that you own.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah,
Go ahead.
an NDA can be fairly light. It just basic, and Aconite and their NDAs are not punitive, but I've seen some coming out of the video game industry that are actually quite punitive. And I always say, if you're signing NDAs, read them. And all that means is that you're agreeing that you're not going to release any information about their property until they tell you that you can talk about it, and you will only talk about it in the area that they tell you can talk about it. For example, we released the name of my book, The Bootlegger's Dance, and the little plot summary. I do know what the cover looks like. I have seen it. I've worked with the artist on the cover with Aconite, but Aconite is planning something a little later on to reveal the cover. So I'm very excited for you all to see it, but I can't share it online. If you trap me at home, I might possibly have a printout of it somewhere, but I'm not going to admit it. But on the other hand, like I said, some of these video game companies, I had one I was sort of talking to, and they sent me an NDA that basically said if they thought I talked about something, they would come after me for thousands of dollars. And I was like, I'm not, nah, no, I'm things, and I just sort of walked away from that one. And I asked somebody afterwards, I said, I've never seen one like that. And they said, oh, it's pretty common in the game industry when you're talking about some of the bigger, and it's more to protect their software. Probably shouldn't really apply to a writer who's doing a spin-off story, but sometimes the lawyers forget to modify stuff. So it's a good idea to have somebody look at it. And if you're not comfortable with contracts, have an agent, have a lawyer look it over before you sign it. Like I
Absolutely.
said, I do my own so much. They're not terribly punitive, so I'm not all that worried about them.
So here's a question I was going to save for later, but it ties in a little bit here, and this is kind of a fun one. Have either of you had people come up to you and ask about the canon in your IP or anything like that, and you've had to either, you know, zip the lips or, just do you have any fun stories around that? Or, how tight is the vault really?
Well, the tough one for me, because like I said, it's been about 10 years now for a couple of my books, and I occasionally will have somebody write me and say, hey, I'm running a campaign, and I'm using the family in City of the Dead, and what street was the gate off of? And I'm like going, let me go look and see if I can find it out, because it's been a while, and I have notes in a binder somewhere, and I've got to find them, but I don't necessarily have it memorized. And sometimes I just never really thought. Sometimes I'll get a question like, is this is such and such happening in this area? And I'm like going, maybe. Here, let me give you Ed's email. Ed is the keeper of all lore. Ed will know. I haven't really gotten that from Markham Horror, although I'm very I just, I'm just really sweet. The folks who, like, somebody tweeted out today, the Titanic went down today, and that's when the deadly grimoire was plunged into the brink for the first time. And I'm like, oh, they caught that, and isn't that sweet? Because I certainly didn't know the Titanic went down today. I mean, I know it went down, sort of, but but I didn't really think about that connection. Somebody else did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. It's one of the joys, challenge, I guess, but also a joy of writing in an established universe like that is that there are people out there who will know, right, and who
Yeah.
really do keep track of tiny little elements of canon, and so I find that really fun, and it's such a collaborative feeling publishing something, knowing that there are people out there, fans out there, who will get the little references that you put in just for them, and will call you out if you get it wrong,
Oh yeah.
Ubisoft and Aconite are there as backstops as well, but I think the fans are the ultimate backstop. So, I often, when I'm writing, I do zip my lip before the book comes out, and I just say, you'll have to read it. But after it comes out, I'm happy to talk about what's been published, and when I'm working on them, I often am, it's sort of an ongoing process of sort of looking in fan wikis and then checking to make sure in the game, like I'll go to the game itself, or I'll go to a YouTube video of the game itself and check that, and just always making sure that I'm not going to mess anything up.
Yeah, I work very hard to try to make sure the mechanics match, and at least as much as I can. I really had fun with Deadly Grimoire because they asked me to make Winnie, who is the female aviator who's shown on the cover of the book here. There's actually a Winnie Havemock card deck, and once they gave me permission to play with Winnie, I had the card deck, and I swear, like every chapter, I would like fan out the cards like tarot cards and go, which little item from the card deck am I going to at least throw into the chapter with Winnie? So Winnie's cigarette lighter is there. She meets Chuck, who's one of the other characters in that card deck. Yeah, there's a whole lot of very teeny. I mean, they're very tiny Easter eggs, and I don't know if everybody spots them, but I had super fun because sometimes that would be my writing prompt, is I would just sort of fan out the cards, pick a card, and go, okay, I'm gonna have sneak by something because sneak by is a card, and yeah, so I had a lot of that. That was fun for me, and the D&D books, City of the Dead has a topiary dragon, and the reason City of the Dead has a topiary dragon, which is one of my favorite characters, is that somebody in Candlekeep forums said that the most useless monster ever created was the topiary dragon, and I went, that's a challenge. I'm going to put one in.
So here's a question from the audience that falls along these lines. When you're working with canon and everything, where do you fall on put the toys back in the box versus make a significant change to the characters and or setting? And really also, what leeway do you have what kind of freedoms do you have to be able to do that, depending on like who you're working with? Kate, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. I think this will often depend on what kind of writer you are, and also what kind of story you've been given the leeway to tell. So for example, with my books, I am telling original stories, so I'm not retelling the game. I'm not doing like a novelization of the game, for example. I think if you're doing a novelization of a game, obviously your leeway is going to be a lot less. But if you're given a little bit of scope to say just work in this setting, so I was given a lot of scope, and but I do have some canon characters that show up as sort of cameos and side characters, and I was very careful with those not to sort of stomp on someone else's work or to stomp on someone's idea. I wanted these characters to be true to my understanding of how they would talk and what they would do and how they'd react and all the rest of it. So I try not to break anything, but at the same time, I don't think you can ever put the toys back in the box exactly as they were, because like the whole point of writing a story is characters are changing, characters are growing, things are happening, the factions in your universe are going to be interacting, and if you're going to have any kind of meaningful storytelling, I think it's going to have to affect the ongoing world in some way, or at least that's the kind of writer I am. I think there's got to be some sort of impact that it's going to have on the world. So trying to put them back with maybe little fresh outfits and a new take, but not broken, I guess, is my goal.
Yeah, I think both of the big IPs, Arkham Horror and Forgotten Realms, we are not allowed to break the world. We are not to end it. We are not going into a world-shattering cataclysm unless we've been contracted to do so. But the type of books I was contracted to work for Forgotten Realms were mostly just to explore and expand and inspire settings. So that's what I did. And actually, that's what I like to do. I always say City of the Dead is very much a novel about Waterdeep because they were reintroducing Waterdeep as a campaign setting. And they gave us a lot of information about how the city had been changed around and some of the things. And they wanted, each book was set in a different neighborhood. And I was Bags the Graveyard, guys. I want the graveyard. And I had a lot of fun with that. But all of my characters are really non-player characters. They are the people who are making the city run, and that the adventurers are probably running by or maybe interacting with. And that to me was the challenge of writing an adventure novel with those characters. Arkham Horror, again, they're not necessarily the investigators. They're people who interact with the investigators, and the investigators may show up, but they are becoming investigators themselves in my novels. And the novels are not, I won't kill anybody off who's a canon character. And frankly, I won't be allowed to. I mean, everything I do goes back to the owner of the IP and they review. And in the case of Arkham Horror, it's very fun. It's the green comments and the red comments. And the green comments are, this is great, do more of this. And the red comments are, you can't do this. This contradicts somebody else's story, which I may or may not know about because it may be something that's being developed or something that someplace we're going with the game. And I said, like, Mask of Solar, which was my first book, it was really fun because almost everything came back green. And I think I had 3 reds and they were very simple to fix. It was one character they just didn't want to have in the book because they had something else they were doing with that character. The funniest one I ever got for Forgotten Realms was with City of the Dead. They sent the manuscript to Ed to review because Ed was writing introductions for all the books in that Waterdeep series. And Ed wrote me a note and said, she can't wear taffeta, because I mentioned somebody having a rustling taffeta skirt, because that technology doesn't exist yet. And then I got 2 pages of what they would have to invent in the Forgotten Realms for them to be able to make taffeta, which is a very Ed way to go with stuff. And I mean, he could have simply said, take the taffeta out and put in a silk skirt, and I would have done that. But I got a really detailed explanation of why no taffeta. So I do know why no taffeta in the Forgotten Realms.
Okay. Here's another question from the audience that kind of relates to this, from Taylor. Do you think knowing about the intellectual property ahead of time is a pro or a con? I know, Kate, you knew and played the Assassin's Creed series long before you got involved. So why don't you start this question off?
Yeah, again, it may be something that varies by writer, but for me, it's definitely a pro. I'm a bit of a researcher, to put it mildly. So I like to know what I'm getting into. And, when I wrote for the video game Evil Genius 2, and I played Evil Genius 1 to every possible completion scenario before writing. So yeah, that's how I work. And I think also even if I hadn't got to that point of research before starting to write, even before starting to pitch or to get to the contract stage, I would at least want to know the sort of basics of, what's the setting, what's the sort of overall tone or mood of this, because is it even worth my time to pitch if it's not something that's going to fit with the way I write? And is there anything that I find really terrible or problematic about this world as well? So I would at least want to know the basics before getting started. And I think when you get to the pitching stage, I have found that I really enjoy having a lot of information, but that's just maybe the way that I work.
Uh, Interestingly enough, Forgotten Realms, I had played D&D in college, but I hadn't played it for years and years. And so when I got the first book contract, I was sort of going around and grabbing everybody I knew who was still playing and saying, can I borrow your manuals? Can I sit in on a game? Because I kind of need to. I'm like Kate. I like a deep dive research. I love historical fiction. So I do an awful lot of that before I even really start. And the plots usually grow out of that because I'll be looking at some weird little point in something and going, oh, this would be really cool to spin the plot off of. Arkham Horror, same thing. I looked at all the properties Aconite had, and they have six, seven at this point of various games that they're spinning off of, including Marvel. They are also publishing all the novelizations, the Marvel novelizations right now. And the property I was most comfortable with was Arkham Horror. I had played the game, and I love the 1920s. I mean, the 1920s America is just one of those periods in history I find fascinating. I knew about them, and I felt like, oh, I could set multiple stories in this setting, and that's kind of how it's developed. The weird thing is it all spun off of the background is it's all spun off of a writer, H.P. Lovecraft. I'm not a big H.P. Lovecraft fan. Haven't read a lot, and before I wrote the first book, Mask of Silver, I checked out like the H.P. Lovecraft anthology that has everything that he ever published in it. It's like this big, the book. And then COVID locked down my library. So I literally lived with that book for a year because I couldn't return it to the library. I just had it checked out until they reopened the libraries. And that was a strange and creepy experience to be locked down with H.P. Lovecraft. But I did do a lot of reading, and I did a lot of reading of H.P. Lovecraft's um influences, like Robert Chambers was a big influence for me for the first book.
Okay. Both of you have mentioned the pitch process in all of
Mhm.
this. So how does that work? Do you get like is there somewhat of an open call for some things, like certain things that they want filled, and then people pitch that, or like Kate, do you get spe- specific things through your agent that they might be looking for, or how does that work?
You go ahead,
Uh,
Rosemary.
yeah, I can take that. Well, I can tell you with Wizards, it how it used to work, and again, they've changed quite a bit, but how it used to work is the editors would decide what series they wanted to put out during the course of a year, and they would have two or three novels under a theme. So the first one that I pitched and got was Crypt of the Mounting Diamond, which was going into a series called Dungeons. And I sort of I was invited to pitch. So this is kind of, I think maybe the difference then is things, and I think this is still how a lot of these bigger IPs work. They have kind of a roster of writers they have worked with or they think they want to work with. They invite you to pitch, and a pitch is usually one or two paragraphs, no more than that, but probably just a paragraph. They tell you really not to do a whole lot of two or three ideas spun off that theme that they're going to give you. So dungeons. And the same thing was with Aconite. They said, okay, if you're interested in Arkham Horror, give us three ideas. So I gave them three paragraphs. If they like one of the ideas, they'll come back and ask for an outline. And again, they'll say, don't keep it really short. They don't want you to invest a lot of time because they're not paying you, and they're fairly, both of them have been very respectful of that. In both cases, I think the outlines were, Wizards was actually adamant it had to be only one page, which was really tough for me. And Aconite, I think I went up to about 2.5 pages. At that point, they sort of either green light or red light, and in both cases with Money Diamond and with Mask of Silver, they said, "Great, now into kind of the contract stage," and then we go back and forth on that, and then they would want a longer outline that they would send back to the. In Wizards' case, they were going through with their game developers. In Aconite's case, they're sending it back to Fantasy Flight Games, who owns um, Arkham Horror, and saying, okay, here's kind of the longer detailed plot. So that one maybe is 5-10 pages. At which point everybody signs off and says, yes, go forth, write a book, and we'll see you. And somebody said, is it short? It's been as short as 6 months and as long as 9 months for me for an 85,000 word novel. I think the current one, we finally got everything signed off for Bootlegger's Dance in July, and the finished manuscript is due a week from tomorrow. So, so you're looking at a slightly desperate writer who's talking to you right now because I have 85,000 words, but there's a little polishing that I still would want to do before I ship it off to my lovely editor. So, so that's, yeah. So I've basically written 85,000 words between July and April. We won't say how
Yeah.
much of that was actually written January through April, which is really sad.
Yes. Yeah, my experience is very similar, and I think having multiple ideas is pretty typical. I've also written for Choice of Games, which is an interactive fiction company. I'll be talking about them with other panels this weekend. And so that experience of pitching for them, I think, had helped me pitch the Assassin's Creed series because it was the same idea. With Choice of Games, it was like, give us 3 or 4 paragraph length ideas, and we'll tell you if there's one of those that we like. And so you can't really be attached to one, or I mean you can, but it's sort of, make sure they're all kind of good, because otherwise karma will make it so that you end up writing the one you don't like. So having a few ideas, so it's sort of a brainstorming process. And then with the Assassin's Creed books, I had 2 main ideas, and we actually ended up taking elements from each of them and switching them, and then working that into the outline. And how it normally works. So if anyone has done query letters and synopses for agents, for querying agents, that's good practice, because the pitch paragraph is really similar to what you would send an agent if you're querying. You want to have the characters, the main characters, the setting, the conflict, what's at stake in that paragraph. And then the synopsis is, or the outline is really a synopsis. Typically it's, and it might be a page or 4 pages. And that's everything that happens in the plot, the main points. And then in terms of deadlines, for me, it's been 4 or 5 months for each of the Assassin's Creed books for 85,000 words, which is, it's been tight. The last one I sent it when it was like not as polished as I would want it, and my wonderful my wonderful editor helped me do a really great revision on it to because it is tight for me to do that in 4 or 5 months for sure, but doable. And it just kind of focuses the mind. I have heard of IP writers having 2 and 3 month deadlines, so I think sometimes it ranges up to a year, so it's somewhere in there usually, but it is shorter than with traditional non-tie-in publishing typically.
Yeah, and the publishing cycle then is much shorter. So I usually fight for 9 months for a year because I work full time. I'm a director of marketing for a museum, and honest to God, I can't turn around a novel in 3 or 4 months. Um, but I have friends who do and who write in that field, but they are pretty much full-time writers. But then on the other hand, by the time it goes to, like I said, so as I said, the final is going to my editor next week, and it will be out in November. And if you know anything about traditional publishing, that is an incredibly short turnaround time, which is one of the reasons why you have to be really good at deadlines, because they've already set the schedules and everything. But normally, like like if you were doing with a New York publisher or something, it is not untypical for them to buy a manuscript and 3 years later the book comes out. And I had a lot of friends who are writers who that's a big frustration. And the nice thing about writing for IPs is one, for me, because of limited time, they buy the book before you write it, so you don't have to sit there and crank out 85,000 words and then have them rejected. I mean, they've committed. And two, you then see the book usually within 6 months of delivering it to the publisher. It's been unusual for me to see it, and that was true with Wizards as well.
So along those lines, obviously you have the quicker time frame or the longer publishing cycle as one potential pro or con. What kind of other pros and cons are there, or that each of you sees between writing for IP versus creating your own from scratch?
I can start. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Please,
Please, Kate.
All right, I will go. We're getting stuck in the doorway. Yeah, I think so. On the pro side, one of the things that I really like about writing tie-in novels is that fanish glee is wonderful. I think most of us don't get that in quite the same way for our own work, at least not until we get to Neil Gaiman status. So having people who are really, really excited to read this next book is really cool. Being part of that fandom community is really cool. Yeah, and that quick turnaround is great. And I really love the collaborative aspects of it, and the fact that you're collaborating with people you've never met and you'll never meet. They might be dead, like you're collaborating in this ongoing conversation, which I find really cool. The downsides are, yeah, it can be quite if you're not someone who's comfortable with deadlines, it maybe start out with short stories and anthologies and see if you can, if it works for you, because it can be a lot of pressure. And the flip side of writing for a fandom is there's also that pressure. Like the Assassin's Creed fans have been fantastic, but I know like it is scary when you're writing for something really big like Star Wars, knowing that many people on the internet are going to be talking about your next book, and that's a lot of pressure too.
Yeah, all of the above. And I think the other thing about writing for an IP, as I said, you don't control it and you don't control the business decisions behind that IP and you don't own it. So I had a phenomenal editor at Wizards. I love the two books. I got out with them. I really wanted to go on with my Waterdeep characters. I adore them. And I got one more short story out of them. And then my editor was gone and Wizards was going a different direction. And I kept getting notes from fans going like, why don't you do another book about so-and-so? And I can't. They've got to ask me. I can't go off and write another novel. And everybody who writes in those fields, we don't have any control over that. If the publisher, the editor decides that they don't want the series to go on, then it's done. And we have to just move on to the next thing, which in my case was 1920s Arkham. So that was cool. So yes, it's always, you're always kind of at that risk of it maybe ends sooner than you want to. And, but then regular publishing can do that to you too. So it's thing, and I totally agree with Kate. I have actually never had bad all my fan interactions have always been absolutely positive, and there's nothing sweeter than having somebody walk up to you at a con and say, I loved your book and I love that I can now share it with my daughter because you have positive female characters in your D&D books, and I'm getting my 12-year-old into D&D and I'm giving her my copies of your books because they're appropriate for her. And that's so nice.
Very cool. So here's a fun question from the audience. Has anyone ever taken a character you created and then used that character either very well or very poorly?
My characters have not been in the world long enough to be used by others, so I'll pass that to Rosemary.
They've never picked up any of my D&D characters as far as I know. Sometimes Wizards does stuff and I don't know they've done it. Like they republished one of my short stories in an anthology and paid me for it, but I didn't actually know the anthology was out, and I totally missed that little blip line on my royalty. So I'm like hunting through the used bookstores for this anthology because it was out of print by the time I knew about it. Um, so that's kind of one of those other oddities that you get into. The Cobalt City stuff, I love my team and I trust what they do with my characters, and I steal their characters all the time, so it's been okay. I'm not sure. I totally agree with what Nate did with one of my characters, but then on the other hand, I adore Nate's writing, so I think it's maybe he did something cooler than I would have done, so that's all right. So I'm trying to now kind of figure out how somebody's life is developed. He goes darker than I do, so I'm like, what you can't make things go wrong. But
So I think this is going to be the last question, and then we'll go through kind of concluding things. But if you could write in any universe or any canon, um, which would you choose? And also, are there any you'd absolutely avoid?
I have a few. So yeah, of existing universes, it's kind of funny because I don't write a lot of science fiction, especially not at novel length. I do in short stories, but so people might not expect it of me. But love the Star Trek universe, and so that's definitely on my list of one I would not say no to. Um, and yeah, I think there are a lot that if someone brought it up, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's great. And I think there's lots of things that TV shows and things that have not spawned tie-in work that I would love to write for. I think about things like the Russian Doll TV show, which I think would make a fantastic bigger universe. So I think there are a lot of possibilities out there. So I'm kind of open-minded, I think.
yeah, same thing. I mean, like, if you're buying for Star Wars and you want to give me a call, I'm open, talk to me. I don't know that I'd want to do one of the canon characters just because I actually always like to do kind of the side characters who are not where everybody doesn't have an opinion about them. So that's sort of my thing. So like somebody asked one time if I wanted to write Elmister in the Forgotten Realms. I was like, no, that's so Ed's character. I don't. I'd like to write somebody who met him on the road and then went off and did something else. The stuff I passed on with Aconite, there's a few things that are maybe more horrific. It's sort of funny. I mean, again, I'm writing Arkham Horror. I am not a horror writer. I don't do well with horror. Body horror in particular really worries me. But I write pulp fiction adventures, and by that I mean like The Shadow and all those great things of the early 20th century, Doc Savage and stuff. So this is how I cast my Arkham Horror. It is not kind of the deep dark um, Lovecraftian stuff that's out there. And there's some really phenomenal writers in that who do that. And there's kind of almost two sets of Arkham Horror books that are being published, and you can know by our covers. If we have a Dan Strange cover, which that's what mine are, they're pulp and they're adventures and they're probably mysteries with paranormal, supernatural elements. If they have this really complicated and lovely sort of Art Deco cover, they're much darker and they're much more horrifying. So if you're looking at the Arkham Horror books, that's how our editor has kind of separated. There's kind of two strains going on in that one particular line. But yeah, I wouldn't say that's it's kind of more the subject area. Sometimes I look at some of the things. I think there's some zombie stuff I looked at and I went, I don't think I can do zombies.
Fair enough. Okay, so we have a minute or two left. Do each of you want to tell us where everyone can find you at Flights of Foundry the rest of the weekend, where they can find you on social media, or again, want to restate where they can find your work in general?
Yeah, I've got a couple of panels tomorrow. I'm doing a lot on gaming and various aspects of writing for games this weekend. So you can find me two panels tomorrow and one on Sunday. I'm doing a workshop in an hour, but it's full. And you can find me anywhere. It's katehartfield.com, Kate Hartfield on Twitter, Kate Hartfield in Wandering Shop on Mastodon. And yeah, I love this convention. I'll be in the Discord a lot. And Greg, I want you to put your info somewhere too, because I know you have a lot of expertise that would be useful to us. So do that.
Yes, definitely. So rosemaryjones.com, you can find the books all there. On Twitter, I'm Rosemary Jones. It's really pretty simple. Last year, for those who are interested in how to pitch, I actually did a workshop on how to write the one paragraph and then the one page pitch for that, and that is still available through Flights of Foundry, so you can watch that. And I will try to remember to post the link over this weekend for folks who are interested in that. I'm always happy to answer questions if you come in through, again, Twitter, and not everybody's favorite social media these days, but it's pretty easy to message me through it, and that's probably the easiest way for me to see you and respond. And I am bouncing around the Discord. I don't have any more panels because the full-time job I work for is doing their great big annual fundraising auction tomorrow. So I will sadly not be watching too much stuff tomorrow. I'll be locked in a ballroom somewhere. Trying to persuade people to give my museum money, and then I'll be finishing a book on Sunday along with my taxes. So it's a very full weekend. It's a very
Good
full,
luck.
complete weekend.
Oh yeah, taxes are a part of my weekend too, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. It's like you should do them earlier, and yeah,
You
okay.
never do. I know.
Yeah, I never do.
Um,
Anyway,
yeah,
but it's
so
gonna be
I'll
fun.
be, yeah,
Yes.
I'll be I'm on a panel tomorrow evening. I'm doing a workshop tomorrow. I'll be around the Discord a bunch. I don't typically do social media or pay that close attention to it, but I am on Discord a lot, and I do keep track of the Flights of Foundry Discord, even or the the general one,
Dream
not
Foundry.
during,
Yeah.
yeah, not during Flights of Foundry. So you can reach me there if you have any questions. Oh, also, Rosemary had a great blog article that she sent to us that has a lot of Q&A about, or it's in kind of a Q&A format, very informative. I'll make sure that I post that in the Discord as well.
Yeah.
Um, but that should
Yeah.
be good.
Thanks. And yes, for the person, do you do side characters because you have more freedom? Absolutely. Anytime I can steer away from the main canon characters, I can have more fun, more hijinks. But yeah. But read Kate's stuff. Kate's stuff is phenomenal, and I really want to recommend her embroidered book as well as her Assassin's Creed, because she
Well,
does
thank you, Rosemary.
historical fiction, and like you can see I have tons of it up here and around the room.
Yay.
Here we go.
And
I'll conclude with the
thank
book.
you for moderating, and thanks tech team and
Yeah, my
attendees.
pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
both of you so much. It's been a great discussion. It's been a lot of fun for me, very educational for me. And I hope everyone in the audience had a good time too. And enjoy the rest of Flights of Foundry, everyone.